Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Nivada Grenchen Broad Arrow Automatic reference 86001A. This watch is available from nivadagrenchenofficial.com for €1,912. So firstly, let's look at the box that the watch comes in, and then I'll talk you through the other items one gets with the piece. So the watch comes in a watch box which is protected by this outer sleeve which one removes. And this is the watch box itself, as you can see, presented to a high standard. One removes the lid and the watch sits on a padded pillow cushion in the centre of the base as one would expect, so it does suffice in protecting the watch in shipping and it's very aesthetically pleasing. With regards to other items, this is the guarantee certificate and each piece is numbered. This is number 80 and I'm pleased to report that the watch is covered by a 2-year international guarantee, which is very reassuring. And lastly, one also gets this Nivada Grenchen Chronomaster tag, which is made from metal. So, with regards to the specifications of the piece, this is the Nivada Grenchen Broad Arrow Automatic reference 86001A. The watch was originally made in the 1960s, and the Broad Arrow chronograph is an iconic Nivada Grenchen piece. So this is effectively a heritage reissue of that piece, but with some modern day enhancements to the specification, such as the original had plexiglass crystal, but this has a double dome sapphire crystal with AR coating. With regards to the dimensions, it's 38.3mm case diameter. However, there is a bezel overhang, so it wears more like a 39mm piece. We have a 46.4mm lug-to-lug measurement, a thickness of 15.1mm, and a lug width of 20mm. The beads of rice bracelet tapers from 20mm at the lugs down to the flip-lock clasp, and as you can see, the flip-lock clasp is signed with the Nivada Grenchen brand emblem to a high standard. Nice to see 4 micro adjustment holes. I'm often critical of brands only having 3 micro adjustment holes in the flip-lock clasp. 4 holes does allow for plenty of adjustment to fine-tune the length to get the perfect fit. So with regards to the rest of the specification, we have a double dome sapphire crystal which has blue tinted AR coating on the underside. So it's a boxed top hat style crystal and it's double domed. It's curved on the underside and curved on the top side. It retains the vintage aesthetic of the boxed top hat crystal in the original 1960s version of the Broad Arrow chronograph, but sapphire crystal is of course harder and more scratch resistant than plexiglass, so they've made the correct decision by upgrading the specification. The blue tinted AR coating is also highly effective in reducing the glare and the highly reflective nature of the mirror polished Broad Arrow hands and the mirror polished subdial hands, so it works very well. But personally I would prefer if it was clear AR coating rather than blue tinted, because I think that the blue tinted AR coating spoils the vintage aesthetic of the piece. A 1960s piece wouldn't have had AR coating, and therefore clear AR coating would be better because it would look like a clear plexiglass crystal as per the original from the 60s. With regards to the dial layout, it's very symmetrical, clearly legible. We've got printed indices and we've also got a well-indexed subdials. So it's a very well laid out dial as per the original Chronomaster Aviator Sea Diver, and this is referred to as the Broad Arrow Automatic and the original was referred to as the Broad Arrow Chronograph. Now with regards to the bezel, I think that they've made a mistake because the original had a bi-directional friction bezel, as does this one, the heritage reissue of that Broad Arrow chronograph. But it's one specification I would have liked them to upgrade. I think it should have 120 click unidirectional bezel, which is now the industry standard. So let's test the Bezel Action. It's bidirectional friction based, so there's no clicks as one would expect. And it does feel very similar to a 1960s Broad Arrow chronograph. It's got the same feeling to it. It's got a firm resistance to the friction bezel, but I personally would prefer if it had 120 clicks and it were unidirectional. And also think they could have added a loom pip on the silver triangle. Now the original aluminium bezel insert just had a silver triangle as per this one, so I appreciate that Nivada Grenchen are trying to make this a heritage reissue piece and keep it true to the original 1960s version, but I think that some things need to be upgraded. They could have upgraded this to having a loom pip and still retain the aluminium bezel insert to retain the aesthetic of the original rather than changing it to ceramic. So as it's bi-directional, I don't need to check the alignment, but I can check the lateral side-to-side play. There is no lateral side-to-side play, and of course because it's bi-directional I won't check for back play. So the bezel execution is good. It feels firm. I like the resistance of the friction bezel. It's just a shame that they didn't use 120 click unidirectional bezel. With regards to the crown, it's solid 316L grade stainless steel, mirror polished domed cap, signed to a high standard with a Nivada Grenchen brand emblem engraved, coin edge finished. It's a screw down crown which provides an effective hermetic seal to 100 metres of water resistance, which is perfectly acceptable. So let's test the action. It feels firm. Now it's smooth, but there is a lot of resistance in the threading, and I think there's room for improvements. It does work very well. One can unscrew it easily. And the movement, the Sellita SW510 BHB, has a characteristic pop. It pushes the winding stem out with a spring-loaded action. So in the first position, it's the manual wind position, and one can manually wind the caliber SW510 BHB to top it up to its maximum 48-hour power reserve. Personally, I prefer a smoother screw-down crown execution with less friction, and one can feel the friction of the O-rings in the winding stem, inside the crown tube, which seals the crown to the winding stem, and I really think that there is room for improvement on it. It could be smoother. One can feel the tension gradually building up in the mainspring, and the Sellita SW510 BHB does feel like a good solid movement, so it is a pleasure to manually wind it. It's available in two versions, manual wind and also automatic. This is the automatic version, but the architecture of both movements is the same, and one can manually wind them both in the first position. Pulling it out to the last click position is the time setting position. It's got a nice light resistance to it, which is a characteristic of Sellita movements, including the SW510. So it's an absolute pleasure to set the time. No backplay whatsoever. The gearing feels very tight, even though it's light resistance, and I like it. So it has hacking. One can hack the second hand dead to set the time precisely to the second. If you look at the 60-second subdial at 9 o'clock, you can see I've now stopped it. I've hacked it dead, so one can set the time precisely. Pushing it back in, it's got a nice positive click. And if you look at the 9 o'clock subdial, which is the 60-second subdial, you can see the subdial hand begins to sweep around once again. So let's test screwing it back down. The SW510 BHB has got a real firm resistance to the spring-loaded winding stem. One has to give it a good push to get the crown in to engage with the stainless steel crown tube, but the threads do pick up very well. There is immediate interface between the two, but I think there's room for improvement. It could be made with less friction. I think that the O-rings could be less tight and it would still retain 100 meters of hermetic seal. I think that it could be made smoother. The threading is okay, but it's not as silky smooth as I would like. So let's test the chronograph complication. The top pusher activates the chronograph, and the lower pusher activates the flyback complication. It makes the chronograph hand fly back to the 12 o'clock index on the dial. So we'll push the top pusher. It's got a nice firm resistance to it, good positive click. It feels very similar to a Valju 7750, which you may be familiar with. Pushing the top pusher again stops the chronograph complication. Now when I push the lower pusher, that will make the chronograph hand fly back to 12 o'clock. And there you can see it's now activated the flyback complication. But unfortunately the alignment is incorrect. If you look closely at the printed 12 o'clock index on the dial, the chronograph hand has reset to slightly to the left. So I like to be consistent when I level criticism at a brand, so I'm going to test it a couple more times just to confirm this. Right, so I'm going to stop it and activate the flyback, and again it's reset slightly to the left. It's off center. It should be bang on in the center of the 12 o'clock index on the dial. I'm going to test it one more time just to confirm this is a fault. Right, so I'm going to activate the flyback. And again, it's slightly to the left. This is wholly unacceptable. This is a Swiss-made piece costing €1,912. It's not a low-tier piece. We're looking at a high-tier chronograph piece. How this passed quality control at Nivada Grenchen, I don't know, because it is a fundamental of watchmaking to check the hand alignment on the subdials, the hour and the minute hand, and also the chronograph hand. They either align or they do not align, and in this case, when I've tested it 3 times in a row, all 3 times the flyback complication works as one would expect, but however the chronograph hand resets not bang on 12 o'clock, it's always slightly to the left, it's off centre, which is absolutely disgraceful. So I'll give you a wrist shot and you can see how it fits on my 8-inch wrist. Now I haven't sized the bracelet, so it has all the links in the beads of rice style bracelet, and I'm pleased to report it will fit an 8-inch wrist with no difficulties whatsoever. Now bear in mind this is a 38.3mm head of the piece, but however there is some bezel overhang, so it wears more like a 39mm because the bezel is larger diameter than 38.3mm. So as you can see, the fit is poor. If you look underneath the lugs, there is an abhorrent gap underneath the lugs. The lug to lug measurement is acceptable at 46.4, but the problem is it has a bubble case back, which I'll show you. And the reason why it's got such a high profile bubble case back, which creates this abhorrent gap underneath the lugs and also under the bracelet, as you can see. And if you look there, there's a huge gap underneath. The Sellita SW510 BHB is available in manual wind or automatic, and this is the automatic version. Now, the architecture is the same, but the manual wind version is much thinner. It's lower profile. It has a flatter, low profile case back. This has to have a bubble case back in order to clear the rotor on the underside of the movements, and the negative is that bubble case back raises the piece up off the wrist, and you get this abhorrent gap underneath both of the lugs and also underneath the bracelet, so it sits on top of the wrist rather than wrapping around it. So very poor fit, bearing in mind that this is only a 38.3mm head of the piece with a relatively short 46.4. As you'll know from my previous reviews, I consider 48mm to be the sweet spot, irrespective of whether you're a collector with a 6 to 7-inch wrist or a 7 to 8-inch wrist respectively. Normally I would expect a piece under 39mm to be perfect for a collector with a smaller wrist of 6 to 7 inches, but I have a large 8-inch wrist, and you can see the gap is huge. It's sitting on top of my wrist rather than curving around it, and really this would look better on an oyster style bracelet with female pivoted end links, because the female pivoted end links would articulate better than the male beads of rice end links, as you can see, because they don't articulate under the case, they don't pull the case down close to the wrist, and they can't in any case due to the large bubble back case back. It feels balanced despite being top heavy, and also I think the taper is incorrect because it's 20mm at the lugs and it does taper down to the flip block, but not enough. This would be better proportioned if it tapered from 20 down to 16 at the flip block, but it doesn't. So really they've got the proportions incorrect, and it does wear like a top heavy piece, and I really think there's room for improvement with it. Now with regards to the heft, it's 143 grams, which is what one would expect for a 38.3mm case on a beads of rice bracelet. Circa 150 grams. Does give comfort, but also a feeling of wrist presence and heft, which gives the watch a quality feel. So it's an aesthetically pleasing piece. The blue tinted AR coating does do a good job of reducing the glare and the highly reflective nature of the boxed top hat style crystal, as you can see. It does look very similar to the original with the patina loom and the broad arrow hands. So I'll show you this bubble case back, which is something I dislike about the piece, and it's something I want you to be mindful of. I think the manual wind version is a better option because the case back is flat, it's lower profile, and also it's thinner. So if you look at this case back, you can see just how thick it is. It adds significant thickness to the piece, and this is what makes it 15.1mm. Really, a chronograph piece should be 13 to a maximum of 14mm in order to be comfortable, to be balanced, not to be top heavy, and also to sit close to the wrist. But you can see that this screw down stainless steel case back is very deep in order to clear the rotor on the underside of the SW510 BHB automatic. The manual wind is much slimmer due to the lack of the rotor. One doesn't need that clearance, as you can see. So the bubble case back really does spoil the piece. It pushes it too far up off the wrist, and as you can see, that's the reason for the gap underneath the lugs. So the screw down stainless steel case back is finished to a good standard, flawless mirror polishing to the circumference, concentric lathe tool cutting to the centre section, and we have it engraved with the brand emblem, the brand logo, and also the specification. It provides an effective hermetic seal to 100 metres. The solid end links are well finished and a good tight fit to the head of the piece, and the beads of rice bracelet is finished to a good standard. Now with regards to the bracelet, I dislike it because, as I've discussed, it really should have female pivoted end links. It doesn't. It has male beads of rice end links, and as you can see, the problem with that is they stick out, and they don't articulate well, and it really does need it for the aforementioned reason of the case back and the gap underneath the lugs. The other problem is it's not smooth. It's very stiff. As you can see, when I flex the links in the beads of rice bracelet, they don't articulate very well. They tend to kink. And this doesn't make for a very comfortable wearing experience on wrist because there's too much friction between each of the links. As you can see, they don't flex like a Jubilee bracelet. As you can see, look, it kinks. Every time you articulate the links, they have a tendency to kink rather than pull straight and flat. And on wrist, this is noticeable because particularly at the male end links, the bracelet has a tendency to kink and it doesn't lay flat against the wrist. So there's room for improvement on it. And the other cost-cutting measure is they've used push pins rather than screw pins, and this is wholly unacceptable for a high-tier piece costing €1,912. I think they really should, at this price point, be using screw pins. Push pins really aren't acceptable. Right, so let's discuss the movement used, because it's one of my favourite aspects of the piece, despite the high-profile bubble caseback. The Sellita SW510 BHB is a cam-operated chronograph, and it's based upon the Valjoux 7750 design. So the Valjoux 7750 is a reliable, well-proven workhorse chronograph movement, which is Swiss-made, and the architecture of this SW510 BHB is very similar to the Valjoux 7750, but it has the addition of a rotor on the underside in order to make it automatic as well as being manually wound. It has 27 joules and it runs at 28,800 vibrations per hour at a frequency of 4 Hz. It has hand winding and hacking, which is useful complications, and a 48-hour power reserve, which is perfectly acceptable. So it's a reliable, well-proven workhorse Swiss movement. I like the Sellita SW510, but I prefer the manual wind version without the rotor rather than this automatic, because as I've discussed, it makes the case back bubble back shaped rather than being flat as per the manual wind version. Right, so let's do a loom test and we'll see how the loom performs when it's charged up to the absolute maximum. So as always, I'm going to use my 100 UV LED torch to charge it up to the absolute peak. Right, so that's now fully charged, and as you can see, it has not disappointed. This is C3 Superluminova. It's clearly top grade Swiss C3 Superluminova because it's glowing very brightly in the characteristic green tone of C3. Good symmetry to the applied indices, which are printed, and the orientation of the dial is very good. One can clearly differentiate which is the 12 o'clock index on the dial. But I think there's room for improvement on the printed indices on the dial. They could use applied indices rather than printed, and that would allow for 5 or 6 layers of C3 Superluminova rather than the 2 or 3 layers that this looks like it has. On the broad arrow hands, the loom performance is very good. On the arrowhead hour hand, one can clearly orientate it. It's different to the minute hand, as you can see, so one can tell the difference between the hour and the minute hand, and it's glowing brightly. But on the indices, it's actually disappointing because it's beginning to fade very fast to nothing. And this really is what 2 to 3 layers of C3 Superluminova looks like. On the hands, we can clearly see 5 to 6 layers, and that's why it's glowing brighter and it's continuing to glow for a longer length of time. But if you look on the printed indices, it's now beginning to fade to nothing, so I would describe the loom as poor performance on the dial, but on the hands it's very good. So this is a disappointment. This watch is €1,912. We're not looking at a low tier piece costing €100. This is really not acceptable for the price point, so I really think they should opt for applied indices and also 5 to 6 layers of C3 Superluminova on the dial in order to rectify that shortcoming. Right, so lastly I'll summarise the piece. What do I think of it overall? Well, when I'm considering reviewing a watch on my channel, the watch should meet 2 criteria. It should be both excellent quality and excellent value at the respective price point. So I'm going to declare this poor quality and poor value at €1,912, which is the price point. It's a difficult piece to weigh up because there are several positives and there are also several negatives. The quality of the finishing to the head of the piece is excellent, flawless mirror polishing to the bevels and flawless brush satin finishing to the flanks. So the quality of the finishing to the bezel and the case back and also the head of the piece are all excellent. The quality of the finishing on the bracelet is acceptable, but however, it doesn't articulate very well. As I've discussed, it kinks. And also the use of push pins is a clear cost-cutting measure rather than screw pins. So these are disappointments. So it's difficult to evaluate the piece because there are some positives and some negatives. The blue tinted AR coating on the underside of the box top hat crystal is good specification, better than the original plexiglass, but however, another negative is the weak performance of the C3 Superluminova on the dial. Now the other thing is the bezel. It's not 120 click unidirectional bezel, it's still friction based, and that really is a disappointment. Really, these are the kind of specifications that should be brought up to contemporary standard. Now above all else, the reason why this is poor quality and poor value at €1,912 is the misalignment of the chronograph hand, and I'm just going to test it one last time just to prove the point. I'll stop it and now operate the flyback, and as you can see, it's reset once again too far to the left. It's not central, so wholly unacceptable, and really this is a disgrace to Nivada Grenchen not getting this right. So for those reasons, I cannot recommend this piece. I think it's very disappointing. I think it's poor quality, poor value, and at €1,912 it does face some very stiff competition. There are better chronograph pieces out there which one can buy. So I hope you've enjoyed my review of the Nivada Grenchen Broad Arrow Automatic, reference 86001A. Please feel free to post your own comments below the video. Thank you very much.